Welcome to another sermon from the Lewes Church of Christ. And now, here's Adam.
Welcome to The Crossing. I'm Adam. If you don't know me, we're really glad that you're here today. And I'm really pumped to be up here. It's been a while since I've been able to preach, and I'm excited about starting our new sermon series today called Women. Now, if you were here at the Five Before last week, you may have heard Mark share how it may be a little difficult to say the title of our sermon series this month, which messed me up all week long. Thank you. Appreciate that. Because, there are so many ways to say this word and say it wrong. You could say, it's our new sermon series, Women. That wasn't come out good from up here, right? And so this whole week I've been struggling. I could say, women. Again, not good, or women. And so this whole week I've been really messed up. Who names a sermon series with just one word? Who does that? As many of you will know Ethan, Mark's younger brother who preached here for 12 years. He's starting a sermon series right now too about women. You know what it's called? Daughters of Eve. Why couldn't we have ripped him off? But don't get me wrong, I love women. See, that doesn't work either, right? This is the title of our series for this month. I'm just gonna move on and jump right in. Mark, thank you. Somehow, some way, I will get you back for this. I actually do love the woman I get to talk about today as we introduce this series, so much so that we actually named our firstborn after her. Good morning, church. My name's Ad. We're going to just reset this whole thing. Just kidding. Today, I'm going to start our series, and we're going to talk about a lady in the Bible named Lydia. And really, on the surface, we don't really know a lot about Lydia. There's not a whole lot written about her. Literally, it's 4 verses. Is all we really know. On the surface, there might not be as much as we might think, but as we dig a little deeper into her story, there's a lot to be learned from her. She was an awesome lady, and I think her life and what we can learn from her is going to speak very loudly into our lives today in a very relevant 2014 kind of way. And so I'm really pumped to talk about Lydia today. Her story is found right in kind of in the middle of Acts chapter 16. And before we jump into her couple verses, I want to give you a little context, a little background. The Apostle Paul, who you've probably heard of, he was a preacher, and he was going around at this time with some of his friends, other missionaries, Silas and the Dr. Luke and Timothy they picked up along the way. And they were traveling around Asia Minor, which geography is kind of like modern-day Turkey, if you will. And they were traveling around, and they were giving out some decisions on some pretty big things that the leadership and the elders of the church and the apostles in Jerusalem had made decisions on, and they were bringing those decisions to these churches. Does that make sense, everybody? So they're out there traveling, and they're visiting these churches. And in fact, it was a great thing. They were strengthening the churches. The Bible says in Acts chapter 16, verse 5, that the churches were strengthened in their faith, and they grew in their number daily. So it was a great thing what they were doing. Eventually, these guys ended up in this coastal town, much kind of like where we live, of Troas. And while they were there, Paul, the Apostle Paul, has this dream, has this vision of a man from Macedonia who's pleading with them, please come and help us. And so the next morning, Paul discerns that this is from the Lord, and the next morning they jump in a ship and they start sailing towards Macedonia. And on the way, Macedonia, it's in northern Greece. So they got to cross over the Aegean Sea, and they make a couple stops along the way. And on their way there, there's a couple stops, and they end up, after a couple days, in a town, a Roman city called Philippi. And that's where we meet Lydia. That's where we pick up. They spend a couple days in Philippi through the end of the week, and then it's the Sabbath day, it's the Lord's day. And so that's where we pick up. Acts chapter 16, starting verse 13. Check this out. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us. That's her story. 3 verses. We'll see one more verse later at the end of this chapter, but there doesn't seem like necessarily there's a lot in there, but there is. There is. Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, was with Paul, and he doesn't give us much to go on, but there are 2 things I think that are very, very clear, 2 descriptions that come out very vividly. He just comes out and says it about Lydia, and they're huge for us today. Luke's 2 descriptions: she was a dealer in purple cloth, and she was a worshiper of God. Or simpler yet, Lydia was a worker and a worshiper. That's how we would describe her. She's like Mary and Martha, if you know the story, just kind of rolled into one lady, which is really cool. But she was a worker, and I want to explore that a little bit. Verse 14 says, one of those listening was this woman from Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. Now here she is. She's a woman. She's from Thyatira, but she's living in Greece. Thyatira is actually over in Asia Minor. So she's a lady living in a foreign country, predominantly run socially by men, who owns her own business, and she's really, really successful. Well, how do you know that? I mean, how can you tell she's successful? Well, here are a couple things. First, she was dealing in purple cloth. Now, the dye to make cloth purple is found in this juice that's inside of shellfish. And it would literally take thousands of crustaceans to make a yard or 2 of purple cloth. So it was very, very expensive. Some would say it was literally worth its weight in silver. And so only the wealthiest people could afford the purple dye. That's why it's the color, oftentimes, of royalty. They were the only ones who could afford it. And so she had this business where she was dealing in this super expensive cloth. And then on top of that, verse 15, Lydia persuaded Paul and all his crew to stay at her house. Well, the fact that she had a house adequate to house a group of missionaries for a time probably suggests that she was doing pretty well, right? And she was a worker, a successful worker. And, wealth and comfort can sometimes be a very dangerous thing, right? Jesus warns us of that, right? He says you can't serve both God and anybody? Money, right? You can't do that. You can't do it. It's dangerous. It can be dangerous to our spiritual health if we don't have things in the right place. But Lydia, she wasn't only a worker, right? She was a worshiper too, and she had the right priorities. She knew what should be where in her life. She was a worker, but as a worshiper of God, she sought out this community of faith on the Sabbath day. Lydia came to the riverside on the Sabbath. It was a secluded place of prayer, Acts says. And we're not really told why she came. Perhaps she came to meet other women, whether Gentile seekers like she was, or Jewish worshipers like she was also a worshiper, or maybe she was there to meet just to pray. Perhaps she came there regularly. Maybe this was her habit. What I don't think she believed was that the Apostle Paul was going to show up with a group of missionaries who were literally seeking anybody who was seeking God, right? This was a big deal, and so she shows up there, and Paul's there, and what happened was that Lydia found the God who was finding her, who had been finding her this whole time. You remember the man in Macedonia who set this whole Paul being here and her encountering God in the first place? God was behind all of it. God set the whole thing up. Paul had a vision of a guy, and here he is encountering a lady. And it's so cool that God was behind it all. I love how the Apostle Paul, who we consider this big pillar, this great guy, is really lost in the background of his story. Isn't that cool? God just needed him to get there so that God could do the work. I love that. That's how God works. That's what he does. He opens hearts. He opens eyes. And the Apostle Paul, he's just kind of lost in the background. And God is there opening Lydia's heart that day. Lydia was a worker and a worshiper. And I think that's huge for us in 2014 today. There's a lot we can learn from Lydia and that we can learn and emulate, but I want us to focus on just 2. I just want to give you 2 things that you can take away today that we can literally leave with today and win with in the days to come. And the first one is this. We need to realize it is possible to be great at both work and worship. It's possible to be great at both. I meet far too many people who wrestle with this. There's this wrestling match where work is pulling on us and our faith is pulling on us, and there's this constant stress and this angst as we try to balance the 2. And it's important to realize that it is possible when we have what I would call the right filter. Have the right filter. I think what I call the way we see things, what the filter with which we look at all of life through. We all have one, and we look through this filter and we discern things based on the filter that we're looking through. And all too often, our filter is messed up. Our filter is our work, or it's our job, our title. And we see our work as the thing we do most every day, so we begin to see things in relation to our work. And so we can do this or we can't do this because of our work. I can't be there because I'm working the next day. I have a deadline at work, so, well, kids, Daddy's going to be home tonight, but I'll see you tomorrow morning just before I leave for work. And so our work becomes where we find our identity, right? And have you experienced that? Right? And that's when problems arise. Viewing all of life based on how it relates to our work is an inaccurate way to look at yourself and your life. It's misleading. Lydia was a dealer in purple cloth, we're told. That's what she did. That's not who she was. Do you see the difference? That's not who she was. Lydia's filter, how she saw herself, wasn't tied to her work. Rather, it was tied to who? It was tied to God. It was tied to her Lord. She was a worshiper of God. Her identity was attached to God. Who she was, what drove her to action, what she used to identify herself and her value and her purpose didn't come from a successful, growing purple cloth business. It didn't come from having a big household or anything like that. It all came from her being a worshiper of God. That's what drove her. That's what was most important. She viewed things through the filter of the Lord and through the filter of His Word. Even this very morning, she was being obedient to what she knew, and she was seeking Him at a place of prayer. She probably didn't know how He might show up this day, but she did apparently know the promise that God promises us when we seek Him with all our hearts, we'll find Him. And so she was at this place of prayer, just seeking God. And that's who Lydia was, a seeker of God, a daughter of God, a worshiper of God. So I guess the biggest question for me, for you, who are you? Who are you? I think I was asking myself that question, and so are you a worker or a worshiper? When you hear that question, who are we, where does your mind immediately go? I'm a teacher. I'm a nurse. I'm a mom. I'm a business owner. I'm in sales. I'm retired. Who are you? How you answer this question determines really how you view yourself. It reveals really what matters most in your life. And there is a right answer to this question, right? I mean, I hope it's pretty obvious. There's a right answer, so you have to be honest with yourself, and maybe you're not really sure. Well, I want to be. I don't want to be identified. Well, let me encourage you, if you're not really sure, ask your spouse. Ask your children. Ask the people closest to you, because you know what? They know. Especially if you have kids. Ask kids, because they're brutally honest, and they'll let you know without any hesitation whatsoever. You see, work and worship both have their place. The fact is, we need to work, right? We need work, but the problem arises when work becomes what we worship. Or it gets in the way, it gets in between us and who you worship. The problem arises when you're trying to serve both God and money at the same time. Learning from Lydia, you can be great at both work and worship. But that only happens when the more important of the two is the more important of the two. Right? Think about Jesus for a moment. Who is Jesus? I can ask you that question. I know immediately what comes to your head. He's a carpenter. No. He was a teacher. He's a preacher. He's a great doctor. Right? Yeah, it's true. Right? He was all those things, but none of us would put our faith in Jesus because he's a carpenter. He's the Son of God. He's God in the flesh, come to earth to save us. It's because of who He is that we trust Him to save us. It's because of who He is that He was and is a great preacher and teacher and doctor, and my guess is probably a decent carpenter. Jesus is great at those things because He is great first in His connection with God, right? Of course, he's a hard example to follow. I mean, he is God and all. I mean, it's a pretty solid connection when you are what you're forgetting. But we have so many others. We have so many others around us here. We have so many others in Scripture and that are great at work and at worshiping. And really, the one today, we have a great example in Lydia. She was great at work and she was great at worshiping because she was great first at her connection with God. Here's a lady who was worshiping God before she ever heard about Jesus. That's pretty cool. She didn't even know about salvation in Christ until this day, but she knew that God was God. And here's a woman who left her hometown and left her parents' religion behind. They were polytheistic. They worshiped Apollos in her hometown. And that's hard. She left home. She left all that behind to seek out the one true God. And that's pretty cool. And when we put God first, that puts our work in its proper place in our lives, I think. And when we have work in its proper place, then work becomes the mission field that God has sent us into. It becomes an opportunity for you to allow the giftedness that God has gifted you specifically with, what He's filled your heart and your life with and your passion. Now work becomes a place where you can let that shine. Work in its proper place becomes a place where you can stand for striving for excellence and stand for being a person of integrity and be different from the people around you, because God is your God and work is what God has given you to do and be what He's given you to do and be. And it's possible to be great at work and worship, but that really only happens when being a worshiper of God, when your relationship with God happens first. And then, like Lydia, you're open to God opening up your heart. And look what follows. The second takeaway we can win with today, and it's totally different from the first one, I think, but it kind of connects, so walk with me, is to develop a habit of hospitality. When we have God in His proper place and work in His proper place and we're a worshiper of God, we just naturally, it seems, the result of putting God first, especially in Lydia's life, we see this, and the immediate byproduct is now we are people of hospitality. We're hospitable. Did you see that in Lydia? In verse 15, it says, when she and the members of her household, they responded, right? God opened her heart, and they responded, they were baptized, and she invited us into her home. If you consider me a believer, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. Lydia invited them, these strange people who she just met that day, invited them into her home. She opened up her life to them. The only other time we hear or see Lydia mentioned at all is at the end of this chapter, in chapter 16, and it's pretty cool. It seems that hospitality has become her habit. In the days that follow this morning's encounter at the riverside, long story short, Paul and Silas, they get arrested. And they're put in prison, and when they get out of prison, we read in verse 40, after Paul and Silas come out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house, where they met with brothers and sisters and encouraged them, and then they left. You see, hospitality became her habit. Paul and Silas went back to Lydia's house, where lo and behold, there were other believers there already. And there it seemed to be her habit. It became her pattern to have people enter her home and to encourage them. And that's an awesome habit to have. Now, I can read some of your minds. Some of you are saying, I'm not having anybody in my home. Not until I put all that stuff in that one closet. And you know that closet. When you open the door, it's like... And I know some of you are thinking that because my wife's sitting over here thinking the same thing. She's thinking, man, he is a wonderful father and an incredible cook. Just a great, solid teacher of our children and the greatest husband ever. But when it comes to cleaning, all right, she's really just mumbling about my cleaning, but point is, you're not alone in that. And that's okay, right? I'm not having anybody in my house. Now, have you seen my house? I need like a week's notice to hide everything. Not clean it up. I want to hide it till you leave, and then it all comes back out. Well, here's where I can help you with that, and at the same time not let you off the hook. So be glad or mad. It's okay. The word is philoxenia. What did he just say? He said that in church? Yeah. This is so cool. Philoxenia, it's the Greek word for hospitality. It's a compound word. It's two words put together, and it's really cool. You might recognize the beginning, philo, right? Phileo. It's one of the 4 Greek words used in the Bible for love, right? It means warmth. It means kindness. We get Philadelphia, brotherly love, right? It means friendship. And xenia means stranger. Philoxenia, hospitality, it simply means to love a stranger, to make room in our hearts, to make room in our lives, to invite someone into our space. And developing a habit of hospitality like Lydia means just embracing all the people that God puts and sends our way. Jesus was a master at this. Think about it. I always thought hospitality meant I'm having somebody over for dinner, I'm going to open up my home. Jesus didn't have a home to open up. Jesus didn't have a stove to cook dinner on. He didn't have a place to offer, a bed to stay overnight. Jesus didn't have any of that. But what he did was that wherever people felt like strangers, Jesus made them feel like family. Out in a field, in a boat, from a boat, along the road, on a mountainside, in the cemetery, downtown in the city, in the slums, or in church. He made people feel cared for and important. And doing that was such a big deal to Jesus that he spent most of his life here on earth teaching his disciples how to do it, showing them how to do it. Sometimes it's as easy as saying hello to someone. Sometimes it's as simple as a smile. Sometimes, guess what? It means opening up your home and cleaning up and sharing a meal. Sometimes it's as simple as a kind word spoken. This past Friday night, Michelle, we're looking for a new car for Michelle, and we saw one we liked online, and Friday night was late. I sent an email that just like goes to somebody at the dealership. So yesterday morning, before the kids and I came to the yard sale, I got this email back from Dave, and it said, hey, this is a great deal, and we asked him to move it, if he could move it to a dealership closer to our home, so we'd have to drive so far. He said, well, it's such a great deal, and I've got appointments already set up, and so I can't move it. And so this is what I sent back to him. I said, hey, understood, and thank you for getting back to me so promptly. I'll shoot you an email this week if time allows us to come and see you on Friday. Thanks again, and have an incredible weekend. Just a simple email, right? Not 3 minutes later, I get an email back from Dave. It says this, Adam, thank you for such a nice email. I'm not used to getting emails from people that are very nice. Most are very abrupt or impersonal. It is nice that there are still people out there that care. I hope your week is a great one, and if I can be of any assistance, please let me know. I literally said thank you. I hope you have a great weekend. Sort of. You see, people are longing for kindness. Just kindness. According to some, like my friend Dave, a kind word is something that doesn't happen much anymore. It's unique, it's rare, it's different, and most importantly, it's always welcomed. And it does something to make people feel important, to make people know and feel that they're cared for. And so whether you learn from Lydia, or we learn from Jesus, or we learn from Dave's response, is that every one of us can develop this habit of hospitality where we just make people feel cared for when they're around us. Oftentimes it goes beyond that, right? You know that. But this is where it starts. A habit of hospitality. I think Lydia's story really calls each of us to be better. She was a worshiper and a worker. She reached out in hospitality. She ran a business. She was generous. She listened eagerly to the Lord's leading. She answered the call to love God and love people before she ever heard about Jesus. She's awesome. I named a kid after her. I'm going to rub off. I want to end this morning, though, with a prayer. And really, when Michelle was pregnant with our Lydia, we began praying for her that she would be a worshiper. That stop. You laugh. That's good. Laugh. That helps. That she would become a worshiper. And that prayer came from an initial, very surface level reading and understanding of who Lydia in the Bible was. I mean, it just came right off that. It's the most important thing. And that prayer has been and continues to be answered over and over. Thanks be to God. But I have to confess, after this week of study, really looking into Lydia, my prayer for our Lydia is going to change. Cool part is I'm not just going to pray it for her. I'm going to pray it for her brother and sister. I'm going to pray it for my wife and I. I want to pray it for our church family. I want to pray it as God goes ahead of us, goes ahead of me, to all the people that I may encounter by the various riversides of Sussex County. Because Lydia sets for us an example to aspire to. It's really a Christ-like example, which is the coolest part. So my prayer today and in the days to come will come straight from this woman's life. And in my closing, I just want to invite you maybe to adopt it and pray the same thing. Would you pray with me right now? God in heaven, thank you so much for your word. It is a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path, and it points us to Jesus. And it's so alive and teaching us and changing us, and I'm so thankful for the story of Lydia. And from her life, Lord, I want to ask you to help each of us, everyone in here today, to live in her likeness, which is really in the likeness of your Son, Jesus. Would you help us to be worshipers of you, God? Would you help us to be successful in our work? Greatly successful. Would you help us to be quick to respond to your leading in our lives? And would you help us to love people right where they are? And God, I just pray that even in this moment right now, like you did with Lydia, would you open our hearts to respond in Jesus' name.
This has been a presentation of the Lewes Church of Christ. We are located at 15183 Coastal Highway, Milton, Delaware, 3 miles north of Lewes on Highway 1. Our service times are 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. every Sunday morning.